My 8-year-old daughter, Penny, stood up in the middle of my father's funeral and asked the question that would send my stepmother to prison for the rest of her life. It happened just as the funeral director was inviting people to share their final memories. Margaret, my stepmother, had just finished sobbing through her speech about how peaceful Dad's last moments were. The funeral parlor was packed with neighbors, Dad's bowling league friends, his old co-workers from the post office where he'd worked for 35 years. Everyone was dabbing their eyes, comforting each other, when Penny's small voice cut through the heavy silence like a knife through butter. "Grandma Margaret, should I tell everyone about the pillow, the one you were holding over Grandpa's face when I came to bring him water?" 200 people turned to stare at my daughter. Margaret's face went from grief-stricken widow to ghost-white panic in less than a second. The handkerchief she'd been clutching fell from her trembling fingers and floated to the floor like a surrender flag. "I'm Brooke Hutchins, 38 years old, and I teach 4th grade at Riverside Elementary. My father, Gerald Hutchins, was 71 when he died 3 nights ago, or rather, when he was murdered. We just didn't know it yet. Margaret had been his wife for 12 years, playing the devoted spouse so perfectly that my brother Nolan and I had actually felt grateful Dad had found love again after Mom passed. Nolan works at the water treatment plant across town. He's 41, 3 years older than me, and the kind of brother who still checks my tire pressure when I visit. He was sitting 2 seats down from me when Penny spoke, and I watched his whole body go rigid. He knew, just like I did, that Penny doesn't lie. She doesn't even know how to lie. When she lost her lunch money last month, she told her teacher she'd spent it on Pokemon cards. When she broke my favorite coffee mug, she confessed before I even noticed it was missing. "What pillow, sweetheart?" My voice came out steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. The entire room held its breath. Penny looked at me with those bright green eyes she inherited from her father, completely unaware she was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of her grandfather's funeral. She was wearing the black dress with tiny white flowers that Margaret had bought her for Christmas. Margaret, who was now backing away from the podium like it might catch fire. The pillow from their bed, the one with the blue flowers on it. Grandma Margaret was pushing it on Grandpa's face really hard. His feet were moving a lot, like when my goldfish was sick and couldn't breathe right. She told me I was having a bad dream and made me go back to bed. But I know what I saw, Mommy. I wasn't dreaming because I remember the water glass was cold and wet in my hands, and you can't feel cold in dreams. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to find words that would make this all go away. The funeral director, Mr. Jameson, stood frozen with his hand still raised from when he'd been directing people to the microphone. Dad's best friend, Tom, dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. My brother Nolan stood up slowly, his 6'3" frame unfolding like a pocket knife. He looked at Margaret, then at Penny, then at me. We didn't need words. We both knew that our father hadn't died peacefully in his sleep. We knew that the woman we'd trusted to care for him in his final months had done something unforgivable. And we knew that my 8-year-old daughter, in her innocent honesty, had just exposed a murder. The room erupted. Some people gasped. Others started talking all at once. Mrs. Rivera from next door grabbed her purse like she might need to run. Dad's bowling buddy, Harold, actually took out his phone and started recording. Through it all, Margaret stood there, her carefully applied makeup starting to run as real tears finally came. Not tears of grief, but tears of someone watching their carefully constructed lie crumble into dust. Penny tugged on my dress. "Mommy, did I say something wrong? Everyone looks upset." I pulled her close, kissing the top of her head that still smelled like her strawberry shampoo. "No, baby, you said exactly the right thing." The funeral home smelled like lilies and wood polish, that specific combination that makes you know someone has died before you even see the casket. I sat in the front row with Penny on my right, trying to focus on my brother Nolan's eulogy instead of the overwhelming reality that Dad was really gone. The Riverside Funeral Home had been in business since 1952, and 3 generations of my family had been laid to rest in this same room with its burgundy carpet and oak paneling that probably hadn't been updated since the 70s. Gerald Hutchins was more than just my father, Nolan was saying, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. He was the guy who taught every kid on our block how to ride a bike. He was the postal worker who knew everyone's names and always had dog treats in his pocket. He was the man who raised 2 kids alone after we lost Mom and never once made us feel like we were missing out on anything. I watched Margaret in my peripheral vision. She sat at the end of our row, dressed in an expensive black suit I'd never seen before. Every few minutes, she'd dab at her eyes with a handkerchief, but I noticed she kept checking her phone, tilting it slightly so no one could see the screen. When someone approached to offer condolences, she'd transform instantly into the grieving widow, clutching their hands and thanking them for coming. "He looked so peaceful," she told Mrs. Chen from the grocery store, "like he just drifted away in his sleep. No pain, no struggle. The doctors said his heart just stopped. It was his time." That same line over and over, like she'd rehearsed, it in front of a mirror. Dad had been sick for months with COPD from 40 years of smoking. The diagnosis had come last spring, right after his 71st birthday. His doctor said with proper treatment and oxygen therapy, he could have several more years. Maybe not quality years, but years nonetheless. We'd installed oxygen tanks in their bedroom, arranged for a visiting nurse twice a week, and Margaret had seemed so devoted to his care. She'd quit her part-time job at the library to stay home with him full-time. "She's been amazing," I told my coworker Janet just last week. "I don't know what we'd do without her. She handles all his medications, cooks special low-sodium meals, even learned how to do his breathing treatments." Penny squirmed beside me, her patent leather shoes making little clicking sounds against the chair legs. She'd been staying with Dad and Margaret last weekend while I attended a mandatory teaching conference in Portland. I'd almost canceled, worried about leaving Penny there with Dad being so sick, but Margaret had insisted. "Don't be silly, Brooke. Penny brightens his whole day when she visits. Besides, she's no trouble at all. She just sits with him watching those nature documentaries he loves or playing cards. Go to your conference. We'll be fine." The call had come at 11:30 Sunday night, just as I was packing to drive home the next morning. Margaret's hysterical screaming through the phone made my blood run cold. "He's gone, Brooke. I went to check on him and he wasn't breathing. The paramedics are here, but it's too late." I'd driven through the night, breaking every speed limit between Portland and home. By the time I arrived, Dad's body had already been taken to the funeral home. Margaret was sitting at their kitchen table, still in her nightgown, surrounded by neighbors who'd heard the ambulance. Penny was asleep upstairs, and Margaret assured me she hadn't seen anything traumatic. "She went to bed at 8:30, like always," Margaret had said. "She doesn't even know yet. I thought it best you tell her in the morning." Now, 3 days later, we were here. Dad's casket was closed at Margaret's insistence. "I want people to remember him as he was," she'd said, "not sick and frail at the end." The funeral program featured a photo from last Christmas, Dad wearing the ridiculous Santa hat Penny had made him, his smile still bright despite the oxygen tubes in his nose. "Mommy," Penny whispered, tugging on my sleeve, "I need to tell you something about that night at Grandpa's house." "Not now, sweetheart," I said, assuming she wanted to share another memory of their card games or how Grandpa always let her win at checkers. "After the service, okay?" She nodded but kept fidgeting, playing with the small silver bracelet Dad had given her for her 8th birthday just 2 months ago. It had a little charm that said, "Grandpa's girl," in cursive writing. She hadn't taken it off since the morning I told her he was gone. Margaret stood to approach the podium as Nolan finished his eulogy. She moved with practiced grace, accepting a tissue from the funeral director as she passed. The room fell silent, waiting to hear from the grieving widow. Nobody suspected they were about to hear the performance of a lifetime from a woman who'd already fooled us all for 12 years. Margaret gripped the podium with perfectly manicured nails, her wedding ring catching the light from the stained glass windows. She looked out at the crowd, pausing just long enough to seem overcome with emotion before beginning her speech. "Gerald was the love of my life," she said, her voice cracking at just the right moment. "When I met him at that grief support group 12 years ago, we were both broken people. I'd lost my husband, he'd lost his dear Ruth. We found healing in each other." People nodded sympathetically. I remembered how happy we'd been when Dad started dating Margaret. After Mom's death, he'd been a shell of himself for 2 years, going through the motions of living without really being alive. Margaret had brought him back to us. "These last few months were challenging," Margaret continued, "but I considered it an honor to care for him. Gerald never complained, never felt sorry for himself. Even with the oxygen tanks and all those medications, he kept his sense of humor." She pulled out a tissue, dabbing at eyes that seemed suspiciously dry to me now that I was really watching. Her voice grew stronger as she went on. "The night he passed, Sunday night, I'd given him his 9 o'clock medications, just like always. I helped him adjust his oxygen, fluffed his pillows, and kissed him goodnight. He told me he loved me and thanked me for taking such good care of him. Those were his last words to me. Thank you for taking care of me, Maggie." Penny's grip on my hand tightened. She was practically vibrating in her seat now, making small distressed sounds that I mistook for grief. Margaret wiped her eyes again. "I checked on him at midnight, just like I always did. Sometimes the oxygen mask would slip, and I'd need to adjust it. But when I opened the door, the room was too quiet. That machine that always whooshed and hummed was silent. I knew before I even reached him that my Gerald was gone." "That's not true," Penny said, loud enough that the people in the row behind us could hear. I squeezed her hand, a gentle warning to stay quiet, but she pulled away from me and stood up. My stomach dropped as I saw the determination on her face, the same look she got when she knew the answer in class and couldn't wait to be called on. "Grandma Margaret," she said, her voice carrying across the entire room, "should I tell everyone about the pillow?" The transformation in Margaret's face was instant and terrifying. The sad widow mask slipped, revealing something raw and frightened underneath. Her knuckles went white as she gripped the podium harder. "What pillow, sweetheart?" I asked, though my heart was already racing with a terrible suspicion. Penny turned to face the room full of adults, all staring at her now. She spoke with the clear, matter-of-fact tone of a child who doesn't yet understand that some truths can destroy worlds. "The one she was holding over Grandpa's face when I came to bring him water. The pillow with the blue flowers from their bed. She was pressing it down really hard, and Grandpa's feet were kicking, like he was trying to run lying down." Gasps rippled through the room. Someone dropped a hymnal. Margaret's mouth opened and closed without sound. "You must have been dreaming, dear," Margaret finally managed, her voice pitched too high. Children have such vivid imaginations when they're upset. But Penny shook her head firmly. "No, I wasn't dreaming. I know because I could feel the cold water glass, and my feet were cold on the floor, and I could hear Grandpa's oxygen machine beeping really loud, not the regular breathing sounds it usually makes. It was making the emergency sound, the one that means something's wrong." My brother Nolan was on his feet now. "Penny doesn't lie," he said, his voice dangerous. "She never has." Margaret backed away from the podium. "This is ridiculous. She's confused. She's grieving. Children mix up dreams and reality all the time." "Then why?" I asked, standing slowly. "Did you tell us Penny was asleep when it happened? Why did you say she didn't see anything?" The funeral director, Mr. Jameson, moved toward the doors, subtly blocking the exit. He'd been in this business for 30 years. He probably recognized when something was very, very wrong. "Grandma gave me warm milk that tasted funny," Penny continued, unaware of the chaos she was creating. "She said I was sleepwalking and having a bad dream. She walked me back to my room and told me if I talked about my sleepwalking dreams, people would think I was crazy. But Mommy, you always say I should tell the truth, even when it's scary." Margaret's carefully styled hair was starting to stick to her forehead with sweat. She looked around the room at all the faces, no longer sympathetic but suspicious, some horrified, others already pulling out their phones. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking for real this time. "You don't understand what it's like, watching someone you love suffer day after day." The funeral parlor erupted into chaos. People were standing, talking over each other, some heading for the exits, while others pressed closer to hear what would happen next. Margaret stood frozen at the podium, her careful composure crumbling like wet tissue paper. "Everyone, please remain calm," Mr. Jameson said, raising his hands, but his own voice shook as he spoke. Nolan was already moving, pulling out his phone as he walked toward Margaret. "I'm calling the police, right now. Nobody leaves this room." "This is insane," Margaret shrieked, backing away from him. "You're going." To traumatize everyone here, believing the fantasies of a child. Gerald was dying. The doctors gave him months at most. The doctors said he had at least a year. I shot back, pulling Penny protectively against me. We were at that appointment together, Margaret. Why are you lying? Margaret's eyes darted toward the exit, but Tom and Harold, Dad's bowling friends, had moved to block her path. These men, who'd known my father for decades, weren't about to let his potential killer walk out the door. Penny, I knelt down to my daughter's level, keeping my voice calm despite the rage building in my chest. I need you to tell me exactly what you saw that night, every detail you can remember. Penny nodded, her little face serious. I woke up because I was thirsty. My throat hurt from the dry air. I went to the kitchen to get water, but then I thought Grandpa might be thirsty too because his machine makes him dry. So I got 2 glasses. The room had gone quiet again, everyone straining to hear her small voice. I walked really quiet to their room because Grandma Margaret always says not to wake Grandpa if he's sleeping. But the door was already open a little bit. The oxygen machine was making the beeping sound. The bad one that means something's wrong. She paused, twisting her bracelet. Grandma was on the bed, on top of Grandpa. She had the pillow with the blue flowers pressed on his face. Grandpa's hands were hitting her arms, not hard, but like he was trying to push her away. His feet were kicking under the blankets. "You're lying," Margaret screamed. "She's lying. Children lie all the time." "My daughter doesn't lie," I said, standing up slowly. "And you know that, Margaret. That's why you drugged her. Warm milk that tasted funny? What did you put in it?" Nolan had finished his call. "Police are on their way. 5 minutes out." He looked at Margaret with disgust. "You killed him. You killed our father." "I helped him." Margaret was crying now, real tears this time, her mascara running in black streams down her cheeks. "He was suffering. You didn't see him at night, gasping for air, crying from the pain in his chest. The doctors were wrong about having a year. He had weeks, maybe days." "So, you decided that for him?" I asked. "You decided when he should die." "He begged me to help him," Margaret said, but her voice wavered, unconvincing. "No, he didn't," Penny said quietly, "because I heard him. When Grandma saw me in the doorway, she jumped off the bed really fast. Grandpa pulled the pillow away and was gasping really loud. He said help when he saw me, but Grandma told him I was sleepwalking and couldn't hear him." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Everyone stared at Margaret, who had gone completely white. "Then what happened, baby?" I asked Penny. "Grandma picked me up really fast and carried me to the kitchen. She said Grandpa was having a bad dream and I was having one too. She made me drink the warm milk. It tasted like medicine, but she said it was honey. She walked me back to bed and stayed there until I felt really sleepy. She kept saying I was dreaming, that I should never tell anyone about my dream because they'd think I was sick in the head like my other grandma. How dare you?" I snarled at Margaret. "How dare you use my mother's Alzheimer's to frighten my child into silence?" Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Margaret made a desperate lunge toward the side door, but Nolan caught her arm. She twisted away from him, surprisingly strong for someone so small. "You don't understand," she screamed. "The life insurance policy expires next month. If he died after that, there'd be nothing. I gave up everything to take care of him. My job, my savings, everything. I deserved something for all those months of bedpans and oxygen tanks and watching him waste away." The words hung in the air like poison. There it was, the truth finally spilling out. Not mercy, not love, but money. Cold, calculated greed. Detective Walsh walked through the door with 2 uniformed officers, taking in the scene of 200 funeral guests surrounding a hysterical woman in black. "Someone want to tell me what's going on here?" Nolan pointed at Margaret. "She murdered our father, and we have a witness." Detective Walsh was a tall man with graying temples who'd gone to high school with Nolan. He surveyed the funeral parlor scene with practiced calm, then nodded to his officers. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us for questioning." "This is insane!" Margaret shrieked, but she didn't resist as an officer guided her to a chair in the corner. "You're believing an 8-year-old child over me." "We're going to listen to everyone," Detective Walsh said evenly. He turned to me. "I'll need to speak with your daughter, but I'd like you present. Is there somewhere quiet we can talk?" Mr. Jameson quickly offered his office. As I led Penny away from the crowd, I heard Detective Walsh addressing the room. "Folks, I know this is unusual, but I need everyone to remain here. We'll be taking statements." In the funeral director's office, surrounded by certificates and photos of the Jameson family, Penny sat between Nolan and me. A female officer with kind eyes knelt down to Penny's level. "Hi, sweetie. I'm Officer Dana. I know this is scary, but we just need you to tell us what you saw. Take your time." Penny nodded and began again, this time with more details. "I went to bed at 8:30 like always. Grandma Margaret read me one story, then turned off the light. But I couldn't sleep because the house was making weird noises and my throat was really dry." She explained how she'd gotten up around 10:30, seeing the green numbers on the digital clock in the hallway. "I got water from the kitchen, the glass with the yellow flowers for me and the blue one for Grandpa because blue is his favorite color." Officer Dana took careful notes as Penny described approaching the bedroom. "The door was open about this much," she showed with her hands. "The oxygen machine was beeping, not the normal breathing sound, but the alert sound. Grandpa showed me once what all the different sounds mean." "What did you see when you looked inside?" Officer Dana asked gently. Grandma Margaret was on the bed, on her knees next to Grandpa. She had the pillow pressed down on his face with both hands. She was leaning her whole body on it. Grandpa's hands were grabbing at her wrists and his feet were kicking. The blanket fell off the bed from his kicking. Penny demonstrated with her hands how Margaret had held the pillow. Then Grandpa's hand knocked over the glass on his nightstand. It made a loud crash. That's when Grandma saw me. "What did she do?" Detective Walsh asked. "She jumped off the bed really fast. Grandpa pulled the pillow off his face and made terrible gasping sounds. He looked at me and said, 'Help,' but it came out really quiet and rough. His face was all red and his eyes looked scary." Penny's voice trembled. Grandma grabbed me and carried me to the kitchen. She was talking really fast, saying I was sleepwalking, that it was all a bad dream. She made me drink milk that tasted like the medicine Mommy gives me when I can't sleep. Then she took me back to bed and stayed until I got really sleepy. She kept saying if I told anyone about my dream, they'd send me away to a special hospital. Detective Walsh exchanged looks with Officer Dana. "We're going to need to test that milk glass if it's still there, and we'll need the autopsy expedited." He turned to me. "Has your daughter ever had issues with lying or making up stories?" "Never," Nolan answered before I could. "Penny's the most honest kid you'll ever meet. Last month, she told her teacher she didn't do her homework because she wanted to watch TV instead. She got in trouble when she could have just said she forgot." Detective Walsh nodded and stood up. "Wait here." 20 minutes later, he returned with a grim expression. "Mrs. Hutchins just confessed, not to murder, but to assisted suicide. She claims your father asked her to help him die." "That's a lie," I said immediately. "Dad would never do that. He was planning Penny's birthday party next month. He'd already ordered her present online." "There's more," Detective Walsh continued. "We ran a quick background check. Margaret Hutchins isn't her real name. She's actually Margaret Brewster from Phoenix. Her first husband died under similar circumstances 5 years before she met your father. Suffocation death, ruled natural causes. She collected a $2 million life insurance payout." The room spun. I grabbed Nolan's hand as the full horror sank in. This woman had lived in our father's house, eaten at his table, pretended to love him, all while planning his murder. "The autopsy results will tell us more," Detective Walsh said, "but the medical examiner's preliminary examination shows petechial hemorrhaging in your father's eyes, consistent with suffocation. There are also defensive wounds on his hands and scratches on his arms." He paused, looking at Penny with something like awe. "Your daughter saved this case. Without her testimony, this would have been ruled a natural death. Margaret would have collected the insurance money and disappeared." Through the office window, I watched as officers led Margaret out in handcuffs. The funeral guests parted like the Red Sea, some taking photos with their phones, others simply staring in shock. Margaret kept her head down, no longer the grieving widow, just another killer caught by the truth she thought she'd buried. Margaret Brewster was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, prosecutors revealed the full extent of her crimes. She'd killed her first husband in Phoenix using the same method, collected $2 million in insurance money, then changed her name and moved to our state. She found Dad at a grief support group, specifically targeting widowers with good insurance policies. She'd done this twice, and investigators suspected there might be other victims in other states. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Penny had to testify, which terrified me more than anything else I'd faced as a parent. But the prosecutors prepared her carefully, and she sat in that witness chair with the same clear honesty she'd shown at the funeral. When Margaret's lawyer tried to suggest Penny had been coached or confused, Penny simply said, "I know what I saw. Grandma killed Grandpa Gerald because she wanted his money. That's wrong." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. We learned so much during those weeks that turned our stomachs. Margaret had isolated Dad from his doctors in his final months, claiming she was managing his care. The terminal diagnosis she'd mentioned at the funeral was fabricated. Dad's real doctor testified he'd been responding well to treatment and could have lived several more years with proper care. Margaret had been decreasing his medications while telling us she was following doctor's orders. She'd been slowly weakening him, making him more dependent on her, setting the stage for his murder. The life insurance policy was worth $3 million, with a clause that would have reduced it to just funeral expenses if Dad died after his 72nd birthday. He was 3 weeks away from that birthday when Margaret killed him. 6 months after the trial ended, Nolan and I held a proper memorial service for Dad. Just family this time, at the lake where he'd taught us to fish when we were kids. Penny stood beside me, tossing flower petals into the water, each one carrying a memory. "I miss Grandpa," she said, watching the petals float away. "Me too, baby. But I'm glad I told the truth, even though it was scary." I knelt beside her, looking into those honest green eyes that had saved us from a killer, walking free. "You were so brave, Penny. Grandpa would be so proud of you." The insurance money, once recovered through legal proceedings, went into trust funds for Dad's grandchildren. Nolan and I donated a large portion to the local hospice center that should have been caring for Dad in his final months. We also funded a program to help families recognize and report elder abuse, named the Gerald Hutchins Memorial Fund. Penny struggled for a while with what happened. Other kids at school whispered about her being the girl who caught a murderer at a funeral. Some parents didn't want their children playing with her, as if proximity to crime was contagious. But her therapist, Dr. Morrison, helped her understand that telling the truth, even when adults want you to stay quiet, is the bravest thing a person can do. "Your voice mattered," Dr. Morrison told her. "When everyone else was fooled, you spoke up. That's a superpower, Penny." A year later, I was tucking Penny into bed when she asked me something that stopped my heart. "Mom, do you think there are other kids like me who saw something bad but were too scared to tell?" I smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "Probably, sweetheart. I want to help them be brave like I was." She's 12 now, and she volunteers with a program that teaches children about speaking up when something's wrong. She tells her story to rooms full of kids, teachers, and parents. She always ends with the same message. Adults don't always know everything. Sometimes they need kids to tell them the truth. Your voice matters, even if you're small, even if someone tells you you're dreaming or making things up. If you saw something wrong, tell someone. Keep telling until someone listens. Dad used to say that truth is like water, always finding its way through the cracks. He was right. It found its way through the voice of an 8-year-old girl who didn't know she was supposed to stay quiet at a funeral. Margaret thought she'd committed the perfect crime, using my daughter's age and innocence against her. She never imagined that same innocence would be her downfall. Sometimes I think about all the what-ifs. What if Penny hadn't been thirsty that night? What if she hadn't decided to bring Grandpa water? What if she'd believed Margaret's lies about dreaming? Dad would have been buried as a victim of illness rather than murder. Margaret would be living somewhere tropical on his insurance money, maybe hunting for her next victim. But Penny spoke up. She stood in that funeral parlor surrounded by adults in their fancy black clothes and solemn faces, and she told the truth. She saved other families from Margaret's evil. She got justice for her grandfather. She proved that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths. That's the power of innocence and honesty. That's why we should always listen when children speak up, even when the truth they're telling seems impossible, especially then. If this story touched you or reminded you of the importance of listening to children, please share this video with others who need to hear it. Leave a comment about a time when speaking the truth made a difference in your life. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that remind us how one voice, no matter how small, can change everything.